Armchair commanders, we call the shots. From our living room thrones where the action's hot. We're the generals of fiction, the masters of war. In silver screen battles with buttered popcorn. Armchair commanders, armchair commanders.
All right, welcome to the Armchair Commanders podcast. My name is Jon.
And I'm Jack.
And this week, we are fortunate enough to have the guys from Little Wars TV joining us. Greg, Tony, if you'd like to say hi and tell the folks a little bit about yourself.
Greg, go ahead.
Well, Jon, Jack, thanks for having us. Tony and I have known each other for a frightening amount of time now, over 20 years. And that's because we were part of a historical wargaming club. So we game, with miniature toy soldiers once a week, every week. We've been doing it for over 20 years. And, relevant, of course, to today's discussion is that very often during these weekly gaming sessions, when we're talking about history and toys, we're also talking about, movies and television shows. And I think movies and TV shows are actually a pretty key inspiration for gamers to kind of get you interested in a topic. So, obviously Masters of the Air just came out on Apple Plus, and I know some guys who are, of course, talking about how to put miniatures on the tabletop to do, 8th Air Force stuff. So pretty excited to talk about today's film, an interesting choice that I look forward to hearing a little bit from Tony about in terms of why he picked it. I am a bit embarrassed to admit I had never heard of this movie. And we'll talk, I'm sure, a little bit more about that. But Tony, I would love to hear why you picked Battleground as a very old film that I had never heard of.
Well, first off, Jon, Jack, thank you for having me. Greg, thank you for joining me and taking time to watch the movie. The movie Battleground, you're right, it is an old one. It's 1949. I picked it in part because, one, it's very old. There's a good percentage of probably this audience, and there's a good percentage of our gaming audience who have probably never heard of the film. One of the reasons I picked it. Two, it was made right after the war. It was made in 49. The Battle of the Bulge was only 5 years in the past. So it's a unique perspective on the battle in that sense. And three, because it's almost not a war movie. And we'll get into that when we talk about it, but it is in many ways it's much closer to being a buddy film than a war movie. And I thought that also was something that you didn't see typically in a war movie. So I thought it would be a good choice to talk about.
That is, I will say that is interesting because I had heard of this film, but I had never seen it. I've seen that a couple of other like YouTube channels has done reviews of this film, but I never watch them because I generally take the approach of I don't watch a movie or listen to a movie review unless I've seen the movies. So it doesn't get spoiled for me, and B, there's more context for it. But this film, it took me a minute to warm up to, which is not normally the case because this film is, like you said, Tony, this film came out in 49. Like my love for war movies and watching war movies started with hanging out with my grandfather, and he was the kind of guy that always had Turner Classic Movies on the TV. So like as a kid, I grew up watching like The Horse Soldiers and Sansa Iwo Jima, all these, John Wayne classics and like really old war movies. So one, I was kind of surprised I hadn't seen it, but two, it just reminded me of all that time of just, sitting and watching Turner Classic Movies. and it very much fits the mold of a 1940 movie. You know, it hits a lot of the tropes of movies of that time. But I don't know why it took me a solid minute to get invested in the film. It probably wasn't until the halfway mark that I was like, okay, I'm digging this. Like I got it. But because I had read a little bit, I was like, everybody's calling this a classic, and it's like one of the best war movies of all time. And I'm just like, first 30 minutes, I'm like, I don't get it. I don't get it, guys. Why? I'm like, why are you making me watch this?
Jack, had you ever seen this film?
So I saw about the last half-ish when I was at a buddy's wedding, and we were just, sleeping the night before in a hotel, and me and my buddy Levi, we were buddied up in a room. We're just flipping through the channels, and we thought, all right, let's just watch this for a bit. The part that he was hung up on was that part where they shoot the flyers at the Americans, and he was like, no way, that's inaccurate, that's Hollywood bullshit. I'm like, no, they really did that. And he was like, no way, they were too strapped for resources and blah blah blah. I'm like, no one ever said that they made smart decisions. Like,
yeah, the Nazis never turned down a chance to push some propaganda.
Right.
And they kind of allude to that in the movie where he's like, oh, they said Hitler said he's going to give them Paris for Christmas. And he was like, yeah, I bet they called this a strategic retreat too.
Tony, since people listening, I mean, I'm guessing, I'm just taking a wild stab here that like 90% of people who are listening to this podcast have probably never seen the movie we're talking about, Battleground. Do you want to give just like a 60-second sketch for people of what this film is actually about?
Sure. It's a platoon of men from glider infantry regiment in the 101st Airborne, and like much of the 101st after Operation Market Garden, they've been pulled out to regroup and reform, and it starts out with them in training, and they're doing drills, and some new people are showing up, and the movie follows this platoon of soldiers, and really it's 20 guys. It's an understrength platoon. Airborne platoons were never big to begin with, but it's this understrength platoon of guys, and they go off to Bastogne, and they're surrounded by the Germans, and they tough it out. But really, it's a movie about a group of men who are in a situation that they don't want to be in. They don't want to go back to the front. Nobody is super enthused about the war. There's none of that hooray Roosevelt and the Republic nonsense. They're just tired soldiers who would rather be home with their wives. And they get to the front and they don't know what's going on, but they stick together and they do their job and they prevail. And the reason being that nobody wants to let anybody down. And that's the movie focuses almost nothing on the battle or the enemy. The whole focus of the movie is the interaction between these men in this time of crisis that they're in.
John, I'm curious as to if the kind of nature of the film is maybe why it took you an hour to get invested. I mean, it's a 2-hour movie, standard kind of runtime. But this movie is unlike many other films I've seen in multiple ways, and I'd love to, kind of touch on those, but I think maybe one of the most important is that this is not what I would call a plot-driven movie. This is a character-driven movie, and it's kind of slow to get into it because there's not a lot. I mean, if you think about what actually happens over the course of 2 hours, plot points, there really aren't that many. It's just a movie about the interaction of these guys together.
Yeah, the overarching thing that keeps it all together is it's the same group of guys in the same place. Otherwise, you have a lot of different vignettes, and that approach to filmmaking, I don't mind that. Um, I think the thing that took me a minute was like, take the very beginning of this movie where they are in just some camp somewhere on their rest period, and you see the guys uh, marching back and forth. You know, because we got to set the scene like, oh, this is an army camp, people are marching. Um, Even that doesn't bother me. It's the like way over the top, like super, like it's like these guys could be on a drill team with the kind of marching they're doing. Like, just it seemed a bit extreme. But after we get past that point, we see our group that we're going to be sticking with in the tent scene, and it follows the very 1940s formula of, we're going to throw like 15 characters at you, and we're going to give each one of them just one singular character trait, so that that's what you know that they are. Like, hey, here's the guy who's annoying because he clicks his teeth. Here's our, you know, southern boy who's a bit on the slow side. Here's our athlete. um and like, I think it's because they don't expand past those personalities until about the midway point of the film, is why it's hard for me to get into it. Because like, once we get to the midpoint of the film and you actually start seeing the traumas that they're experiencing, and like seeing their interactions with each other through those events, I think that's when this becomes a great film. But when it's just like, you know, dude complaining that, oh, I'm a civilian now, like, for 30 minutes, like, I think that's what makes it difficult to get on board with.
I I think that scene where they're all in the tent and it just kind of goes around the room, and it's new guy and southerner and Rodriguez who's from Los Angeles, and around the room like that, and you only get that one sentence description. I think in a way that works, because later in the film, when we see them under duress and in fear for their lives and unsure what's going on, is now we see the more complexities of their personality and their interactions. Like, they're doing the phony bravado thing in the tent with each other. Somebody has just come back from recovering for a wound, and they're all, they're all in their macho soldier behind the lines kind of mode where they're ribbing each other. And but then once they get into combat and it's all business and it's a do or die situation, then you see them start to open up, and you can see the nuances in the personalities and the nuances in their interaction. And it does start off slowly, but I like that in the beginning they're all just kind of a trope, and then later in the film we see how these people actually interact with each other and care about each other.
See, I
Yep.
think that's probably why the midpoint is where I get invested in the film. Because if it seems to me as though, take like Sands of Iwo Jima, you have Stryker, and I forgot the name who his main foil counterpart was, but they have like the whole film is based upon them having this antagonist relationship with each other, and they both remain the same person pretty much throughout the entire film until the very last scene when John Wayne dies, and then the other guy who's his antagonist takes his spot, and then he changes. So like, I think, me personally, my brain was kind of in the, this is a 1940s film. I've been introduced to the characters, and these are who they're going to be for the rest of the film. And it's not until I see the things you're describing that I'm like, oh, this is actually a pretty solid movie. Like, this is good.
Well, and I think for us looking at it from 2024, um we've accepted as tropes and stereotypes so much of what we see in that movie, and because now it's been done to death. I think at the time, and I should probably go back, one of the reasons for picking this movie, as a young man, I had a friend who was a World War II veteran. He was in the 1st Infantry. He landed in North Africa. He landed in Sicily. He was in the first wave at Omaha. He fought his way across France and was wounded on Christmas Eve, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, where the 1st Infantry was involved. And he told me that this is the most realistic war movie ever made, in that it felt very much like the sort of interactions and chatters that he remembered from the guys in the unit at the front. And that while they were stereotypes, it was because in most units there were some guys that fit these stereotypes. America in the 40s was very, very different, culturally, um, compared to what it is now. There were no suburbs. There were city folk and there were country folk, and there was nothing in between. And so there are some more tropey ways of looking at things, because there were, culturally, it was a much different world in the 40s than it is here in the 21st century.
So you've both mentioned, some of these like 1940s tropes that may have jumped out at you in the movie. The What jumped out at me most actually was a trope that I was expecting to see but didn't. I was expecting, going into this movie, knowing really nothing about it except how old it was, that this was going to be some kind of like rah-rah, peppy 1940s war film, go get 'em, boys, classic John
Boy, howdy,
Wayne.
we're going to give the Nazis some business.
Exactly, right? I mean, that's what you're thinking this is going to be. This is a celebration of America and how we kicked the Nazis' asses at Bastogne. It was not that at all. I mean, it completely surprised me. First of all, this is like not a rah-rah war film. And specifically, I was really surprised that there are moments of cowardice in the film. I mean, there's a character, I forget the guy's name, who literally like runs away like from the engagement. And he ends up dying towards the end of the film in a very unheroic kind of way, when like a building collapses on him. But he's like a shirker. Like he doesn't even want to fight because he's afraid. And that's the kind of stuff you don't really expect to see in a 1940s depiction of World War II. I mean, I wasn't thinking we were going to get that at all.
And you see that a second time with Sergeant Holly, when they're at the railroad crossing and the Germans are attacking, and he gets up and he goes over the other side of the embankment and he gets to the underpass, and he's thinking of leaving. And then the new guy, Lawton, is like, I'll follow you. And then he's like, oh, all right.
I can't leave
Shit,
now.
I guess now we're going to have to do some heroic stuff, because the new kid is crap. And you can see it. He's like, he has that moment where he's like, son of a, I was going to hide out here, but now why don't we just charge? And if we die, but yeah, that the depiction of some people who were not enthused to be at the front, you're right, especially in the 40s, that was, whoa, how could they show that? But it's a reality of the situation. I've talked to some veterans and they were like, hey, if we can get back to battalion HQ for some reason or another, we can take a couple of hours before we head back to our unit, get some hot chow, hang out, avoid dying for a half a day. I mean, that's the reality. There's some of that goes on.
Can't hear you, John. You're on mute.
John is hating technology at this moment.
Still on mute.
Well, while John sorts his life out, Jack would be interested. Jack, I'd be very interested to kind of know what you thought the depiction of the GIs was, and whether or not you found that as surprising as I did for a 1940s film.
I'd have to say I was pleasantly surprised. Like you said, This came from a time when there was a lot of rah-rah war movies and not a lot that focused on the human side of war. Like the people talking, that one guy trying to hook up with a French girl that let them stay the night,
Yeah.
then stole her
The only
eggs.
woman in the film. Yeah.
And stole her eggs. True romance.
That's illegal in several states now, by the way.
Stealing eggs.
Doing anything with a woman's eggs.
Ah, gotcha.
That
Now I
was
get it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
We
we
can.
can hear you now.
Okay, I was going to say that's a deep cut, Tony. I will say, the whole egg bit, I got a kick out of that. I found it funny. Also, it's like for a viewer of today, it's something that I think people would probably miss or be like, this is a weird thing for them to add in. But it's a point of the film that I'm like if my grandfather and my grandmother watched this film like in the theaters when it came out and they saw that scene, it would 100% make sense to them because they lived through rationing during World War II. So like eggs were such a hot commodity, like near impossible to come by. And to see him be so like, obviously he's dejected, he's throwing his breakfast out, but like to see him so dejected because he's like, I have like the holy grail of food right here, and now I have to like dump it out, and now it's like dripping down my face because I have to wear my helmet again. Like that level of pain, I think, is not something that would register with most viewers today because they don't have that connection or that thought process associated with it.
Right. And, for the the frontline GIs who are eating K rations and basically cold processed food day in and day out, those eggs were a treasure. And you got to be looking forward to the point where I can just scramble these eggs up and have an actual hot meal of real food. And then to have to suffer that loss. You're right. That was a moment in the film.
I also loved like when he tried going to cook his eggs like round 2 and it happened again, but this time he hands his eggs over to his foxhole buddy. He's like, "Hey, watch these! Don't let any dirt get into them." And his buddy's just like stares at him. He's like, "Fine, you can have half of them."
Right. Oh.
Yeah, it's those little interactions that really, I mean, that's basically the whole film. And I do think that if you like the film, and I did like the film, that's the reason why you like it, because it feels like you're a fly on the wall and that these are your friends. I mean, these are like the conversations you'd be having with your buddies, and it just so happens that they're in a really shitty place at a really bad time. But that's like a level of camaraderie that reminded me, as I was watching, there were two films I was thinking about while I was watching this film, and for two totally different reasons. The first one is Saving Private Ryan, because I suspect that for people back in the 40s when they saw this, I mean, I read about the legacy of the film after I watched it, and it was very, very popular and well received in 49 when it came out, and apparently had a pretty long ripple effect after that. My generation, our film was Saving Private Ryan. That was the big, huge, 5 Oscar winner about a squad of guys on the European front of World War II. And the interactions that they had reminded me very much of this film. So in that sense, I thought it was an interesting comparison, because Saving Private Ryan is a lot more plot driven, much more plot driven and, action oriented than this film was. But at its core, it really was similarly structured in terms of being about a small focus of a very small number of characters who are just interacting with each other. I'm wondering if I would love to know for you guys what films you were thinking of in real time when you were watching this, because Saving Private Ryan was one of the two that came to mind for me.
Band of Brothers.
Okay, sure, yeah.
I would go kind of a little earlier than that. This film reminded me quite a bit of the original All Quiet on the Western Front, the 1930s version. Um, just because kind of similar acting styles as far as like, you know, acting in that time period versus today, but also for a 30s or 40s film, you know, this doesn't, I would say it glorifies like the U.S. service member, but it doesn't glorify war, which I think is a unique take for the time period.
Oh yeah, I would definitely agree. Um, and it's interesting if you watch, you see almost nothing of the enemy in action. You see them right before the Americans ambush them, and you see some prisoners after that. But for most of the shooting, they're just shooting at sounds and shadows. And there's a whole lot there in the film showing that these guys really are just they are just bit players in a they don't even know where Bastogne is, which isn't inaccurate by any means. Um, they don't know where they're going when they ship out. They don't know what's going on outside of their company. Um, they realize that they're in Bastogne, but they don't. They debate, well, is that in Belgium or is that in the Netherlands? They're not sure. They don't really know anything of the big picture. And I think that having been raised on later war movies, and I know, Greg, you and I briefly touched on this earlier, you see things like the 60s, Battle of Britain, Patton, Battle of the Bulge, early 70s with A Bridge Too Far. These war movies on this epic scope where they're covering theater wide operations, and we're watching the interactions of generals and maps, and they know all the stuff. And you go to this movie, and it's these 10 guys who aren't sure how you pronounce the names of the places they're in or what country they're even in. And they just know that, well, somebody higher up sent us here and we got to do this thing. And if you talk to GIs who have combat experience, apparently that's standard throughout the Army's history. Um, those guys just they go where they're told and they do what they're told, and they bitch and complain about it. And I think in that respect, um, it's it has a certain element of realism, because here's some guys who are like, here we go again, and we're going to go off and do whatever it is they tell us to do to the best of our ability.
You mentioned the lack of an antagonist, the lack of the Germans. There, like you said, the Germans appear very infrequently in the film. I mean, I think the most notable scene is they had to include the famous nuts scene, where the German officer comes to offer terms for the surrender of Bastogne. I mean, honestly, other than that, you barely see them. Which is an unusual story structure, right? And that's a little bit also why it reminded me of well, you could say the same about Band of Brothers, but of Saving Private Ryan, because who's the antagonist in those films? There really is no traditional antagonist. It's not a story that's set up that way. And I generally prefer a movie. If we get to the end of this podcast and we're like rating the movie, something I will circle back to is that I generally prefer movies that have a little bit more of a traditional story structure. And Battleground, there's nothing traditional about the story structure in Battleground. You don't get an antagonist at all. I don't know, to me, there was something a little bit off about that, actually, in terms of the way that the movie was paced.
I think if you get a little like meta about it, you could say that just the environment of war itself is the antagonist, because like, and I think that's showcased by all the complaining that is done, because it's like you got guys who dig these foxholes, and the second they're done they're like, okay, we're moving. It's like, god damn it. Or like, um take the person, like when they're in Bastogne dropping off one of their wounded guys, and one of their buddies happens to be working as in like the mess kitchen now, and they're like,
Yeah, the guy
"What are
who
you
ran
doing
off.
here?"
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's
the
like, "What
guy
are
I
you doing
mentioned.
here?"
Yeah.
And he's like, "Oh, they wouldn't possibly let me go. Now I just learned how to cook."
Sweet
But
deal.
right, so A, you're mad at him for that, but then secondly, you're like, "Hey, you got anything you can lend me? Because like, hey, we used to be in the same group together. Like, hook me up." And it's like, I don't know, we got a half loaf of bread, and like, sweet. And you look down and it's gone, and you find out that your other buddy took it to sweet talk the French girl. Um, that's just the nature of war, which is the continual disappointments and getting screwed over in different things. So I think for me, I viewed that as the true air quote enemy in this.
Yeah, so that brings up an interesting question I asked Tony, I think on Facebook last night, or maybe it was this morning, because last night I watched the film for the first time, so I'm pretty fresh off this. I would love to know, John and Jack, how long were you into the movie before you realized there was absolutely no music anywhere?
It was during the fight scene that the lack of music kind of made it awkward, in my opinion. But
I will say I was to this moment now aware of that. So
It took me a long time into the movie to realize, hey, wait a minute. And I think, Jack, you mentioned like the word awkward. It was
during the fight.
yeah, it was late in the film that it dawned on me, wait a minute, like there hasn't been any music at all in the
I'll
entire movie.
confess, Greg.
I mean, unless you're counting the cadence, but
Right. No, but no, there's no score,
I,
right.
which
I'll
is
confess. If you had not told me this morning that there was no music, because I watched it today so that it would be fresh in my mind. I've watched this movie half a dozen times. If you had not said that when you mentioned this question just now, I would have been like, John, what?
you didn't notice. You didn't notice the
I
lack
did
of
not
music.
notice. I've watched that movie
Wow.
probably half a dozen times and not noticed. But once you pointed that out, I and it does add a certain and I think it's deliberate that there's no music, and the awkwardness that no music, that is definitely a choice. And this, one of the things I like about this film is that for a 1949 war movie, there are a lot of choices here that are outside the box of the war movie genre of its day, or even after that. There are a lot of out of the box things about this movie. There's no music. Um, we see the enemy almost not at all. We the the bigger picture isn't in this picture. There's no, the closest thing we have to for God and country is the chaplain asking, the $64 question, why are we here? And, the troops are kind of like, can we get chow now? They're not like super stoked about, yeah, preach it. Um, they're listening, but they're not all revved up about the word of FDR.
I really appreciated the Jeep Hood sermon scene.
That's a powerful
And
scene.
it
Yeah.
is. The thing that stuck out to me in that scene was obviously there's a panning back and forth between the guys who have been, freezing and fighting, and they're dirty and, they're hating life at the moment. And here's this guy trying to tell them, like, this is worth it, guys, I promise. But the camera at one point, it starts on the chaplain's face, and he has like a well-washed face, his helmet's clean. It starts panning down his uniform, and like it's not like clean, but it's still kind of crisp. Like it, he hasn't been like working in it. And then it finally ends on his feet, and you see that his feet are wrapped in rags. and you're like, okay, like, so you're able to put yourself in the shoes of these guys who are receiving the sermon, where you're like, yeah, whatever, but then you also get that clicking moment of like, no, he actually is here with us experiencing the same thing.
Yeah.
Maybe not on the same level, but he is experiencing the same thing.
I loved that scene. I thought that scene was really great. The camera panning down to the boots wrapped in rags, that jumped out at me. I also thought it was a really interesting scene to watch as someone who, I'm pretty well read on this history. You know, Tony and I are both very big World War II history buffs. And something I think that might surprise people nowadays that would have been much more understood back in the 40s was that in the immediate aftermath of World War II, there were a lot of people asking that question that the preacher asks. You know, the question he asks, the $64 question is, you know, was it worth the trip? I think that's the exact quote. Was it worth the trip? Not necessarily why are we here, but like, was it worth us deploying over here to do this? And I think that nowadays there's an assumption that, oh, you know, this is the greatest generation. You know, of course they understood the nature of the sacrifice and they did this heroic thing to save the world. Back in the immediate aftermath of World War II, there was a good bit of ambivalence in the United States, and I'm sure in other countries, but in the United States about like what we had just been through. So I think that question really would have resonated at a different way to the audience in the 40s than maybe it resonated to us. Because I think if you don't have that context, you're watching it now in 2024, like, oh, this is the obligatory, you know, good for you, Uncle Sam moment where the guy says, well, we had to come over here to kick the Nazis out of Europe. But I think that would have read much differently at the time.
I think, and I'll ask Jack this here in a moment, but you know, ultimately the war in Europe comes down to, you know, big picture, like, you know, if you look at like Civil War history, what's the easiest or like bullet point answer for the Civil War? Slavery. Like, there are umpteen million books that you can do to study about the Civil War, but that's the bullet point answer: slavery. Just like there are umpteen million things you can study about the European theater in World War II, but the bullet point answer for that conflict is the Holocaust. I think today we're far enough removed about it, and we have had it like pounded into us, like, this is what happened and it was really bad, we can't let it happen again, that we're like, yeah, of course, Holocaust bad. But like, i I couldn't imagine being someone who, let's say you are a civilian who's in the United States, you go through rationing, almost everybody you know goes and fights overseas or is working in factory, like everything is war, war, war. And in 45 you go to the movie theaters one day and you see film of the concentration camps. Like, I could not imagine trying to process that for the first time through that format, because like, what I want to get at with this is like, you know, the service members, anybody who's in the vicinity of a concentration camp was ordered, you will go there, you will look at this, so you will understand. I know from my own education, I don't know, Jack, when you started like your Holocaust education in like middle school, high school time frame, but it wasn't something like, it was something I knew, and it was something I was aware of and I knew, but it wasn't something I truly understood, or I didn't get the gravity of it. Like, you, because I don't know if it's an age thing or not, but I know personally it was like, okay, I read Night by Eli Wiesel, or you watch Diary of Anne Frank and all that stuff, and you're like, yeah, this is terrible, but it's still hard to like click. And it wasn't until I went to the National Holocaust Museum in DC and you're actually able to physically see like the piles of shoes, box cars, all of these things. Like that was the moment for me that it actually like okay, I get it now, that like this makes sense. And I wonder, Jack, if you had like the same kind of learning curve, or like did it take you a while to like understand it the way I did?
What I mean, what do you mean by that? Because I learned about the Holocaust way back in elementary school.
I guess having been exposed to it from such a young age, at what point did the gravity of it actually hit you?
I can't really pinpoint a specific moment, but I think it was around in middle school where it clicked, where I was like, "Oh my god, this fucking sucked," and I really don't think it's possible today to grasp the full scale of just how awful it was, having never seen the camps for ourselves or having been there.
I think I think that's why the preacher scene kind of hits the way it does in this film, is because, like 4 or 5 years removed from the end of World War II, something you haven't or are still trying to conceptualize and hasn't been like pounded or reinforced into you yet. I could see how like with a little bit of space you could be like, I don't get why we did this. So I think that was important for that moment to exist in this film.
Well, I also think that the reason that scene is important, given the time frame of the movie, Greg, you had alluded to the fact that there was some, at that time, there was some ambivalence about, was this worth the cost? And part of that reason that there was that ambivalence, 45, we won the war. We beat the Nazis. We beat Japan. Um, we are riding on this wave of euphoria. By 49, the Russians have stolen the A bomb secret from us. They have conquered half of Europe with no intention of returning it. And so there's that there's that moment where, the Americans are looking at the war like, we sacrificed all this, and now it looks like we're going to just have to fight another war with our former ally. The threat of, the Berlin airlift was the year before this film was made. The threat of a war in Europe flaring up again and the boys having to go back was very real and in the forefront of American minds at the time. And I think um, that speech speaks to the politics of the day, at the time the film was made.
Interesting. The politics of the day. John, Jack, I don't know if you guys read anything about the background of this film. I read a little bit.
Well,
I read about it before I watched the film, and I'm really glad that I did, because it gives you a whole different appreciation for this movie. This movie wasn't supposed to be made. Multiple studios rejected this film. The studio that ultimately made the film, MGM, backed it very reluctantly, cut the budget for the film. They were going to bury this thing. They were really only making it because one guy, one producer, pushed it and wouldn't let it go. And of course, ultimately, the movie went on to make a bunch of money. It was a huge success for MGM, and they would later claim that they were always very much behind Battleground. But it is
right?
really
It's an Oscar winner. We obviously did this on purpose.
Right.
we love it. I mean, did you guys do any reading about the background of the film? Because I actually thought that the making of the movie was maybe even more interesting than the movie itself.
Well, the problem with that is Jack can't read, so
Well, then he's
um,
out.
One of these days.
you keep trying. Shapes and colors first. Um, I read a little bit because there were certain things that, I read about the actual like technical aspects of the filming, kind of like how this film paved the way for a lot of future other Bastogne filmings. Like a good chunk of this was done indoors with controlled climate and all that. And, it set, really set the path for when Band of Brothers would come back and do it. They would do it in the same way. They would go into this big warehouse and essentially build the art den forest inside, because then they can control the fog and the snow, all that. So I found that very interesting. I wasn't aware of its struggles to get off the ground. I was aware that this was an interesting take because I believe it was the person who actually wrote the script. I forget his name, but he was originally involved in Hollywood before the war. Like, he did a lot of Marx Brothers stuff, went, fought in the war, came back, and is like, I need to do a film about my experience, or just the experience of fighting. So I found that to be interesting. The other thing, and I don't know why I went down this rabbit hole, because it was just something that made me so mad. But the character who constantly clicked his teeth, like that was his defining character trait. I was like, what idiot put this in the script? Like, this is making me so mad. But I found out that that actor also was a World War II vet. He served on an aircraft carrier, and that aircraft carrier experienced an explosion of some sort. And he legitimately lost all of his teeth in the war. So, like, that wasn't just some written character gimmick. That was just who he was. And he's like, this is how I'm going to differentiate my character from everybody else. So I know that was a weird thing. But no, I did not look into the actual, like, getting off the ground part of this film.
Well, I mean, so you mentioned the writer, Robert Pyrosh or Pirosh. Yes, he was a veteran of Bastogne. They had historical consultants from the 101st Airborne, veterans who fought there. Most of the extras, the background guys, the GIs who don't have speaking roles, are actual combat veterans from Bastogne that were recruited to do this film. The director of the film, I was reading about him, super interesting guy. Apparently, he was like a mentor or like an idol of Clint Eastwood's. The director of this film had done some war movies before, was a veteran of World War One, and was a fighter pilot in World War One, was shot down, was seriously injured. And he was like absolutely insistent on bringing as much authenticity to this film as possible because of his experience, because he himself was a combat veteran. And I mean, on the one hand, you can look at that and say, well, yeah, I mean, these are all reasons why the movie has the authenticity that it does, because they have so many people who were connected to this battle or connected to war. But I kind of looked at it from a modern perspective, from like, okay, 2024. It's really sad to say this, but like, who who would you even go to now in 2024 if you wanted to find a director to direct your war movie who had even a tangential connection to any kind of combat history? Like, we are so far removed from that as a society. I mean, you're talking about a time in the 40s, we mentioned this earlier in the chat, where a huge percentage of the population either served in the war directly or indirectly on the home front. Like, everyone had a connection to this touchstone. And so it makes sense that, yeah, the people who were involved in making this film, they had a lot of connections to this, like deep personal connections. And now you look at Hollywood today, and it's like everyone is completely detached from this reality. Nobody working in that business today could bring this to the film, which is sad. I mean, it is honestly sad.
I think the last like modern example of that is God, when I think it came out 2012, 2013-ish, but there was a movie, it was called Act of Valor, where it had a bunch of
Yes.
Navy SEALs starring in it, which
Yep.
I don't know when or if we'll get around to that film, but I God, I hated that film. It was so bad. But that really is the last film, most recent film I can think of where you actually have the people who are involved, playing themselves basically.
And not just the actors, too. I mean, think of the production staff. I mean, we're talking about a film here, Battleground, where the writer and the director are combat veterans. That's remarkable. I mean, maybe it wasn't as remarkable in the 40s when so many people
Right.
had served, but today, from our perspective, looking back on that, it's like, wow, that's something that is just completely lost now. You just can't recreate that even.
Oh yeah, and if you think about it, something like 1% or less than 1% of Americans today have been involved in combat. And I'm not saying that's a bad, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there should be more. Um, but it World War II, in the years after World War II, everybody and their brother was in some way connected to the war. And like you said, a lot of people were in the war industry. As a boy in the 70s, um, in the neighborhood I grew up in, there were all these older men who were heading into retirement who, like, my neighborhood was filled with old guys who had been in World War II. Guy across the street had been in the Navy and had survived a kamikaze attack on the ship he was on in the Pacific. Couple houses up, somebody had landed at Anzio, and like our neighborhood was filled with those people. And it was commonplace. At that point, the war was 30 years in the past. So all those guys were in their 50s, and, they coached the little league teams, and they took care of the ball field, and they ran, this, that, and the other. And there was it Studs Terkel who referred to it as the good war? There was this huge block of Americans who had participated in the war, and the war was like a feel good thing. Oh, yes, the good old days. And and it was, and we laugh about it now, but you know, it was a badge of honor. And like the St. Crispin's Day speech, the man who wasn't there thinks less of himself, kind of thing. And that's a bygone era, and hopefully we're never going to get there again. Um, but yeah, it definitely, I think, has an impact on how war films were made then versus how war films are made now.
Yeah, I mean, with the exception of there being a World War III, I don't think we're going to approach that again. That or maybe like a Red Dawn situation, but
Now that's different. If there's a Red Dawn situation, I'm all for it. I'm ready. Reads.
I think one of the reasons I took us down that rabbit hole is that I think that watching Battleground, I think you get a lot more out of the film and you appreciate it more the more you know about the history. Not just the history of Bastogne, yes, but also the history of kind of how the film was made, the world in which it was made. I think if you just came into this cold and you were watching it, it'd be very easy to be like, I mean, this is like kind of an old cliche 1940s black and white film. Like, what's the big deal? Well, it was a big deal. I mean, it was a big deal then. And if you understand why it was a big deal then, you do get a more of an appreciation for like, okay, I see why people said this really was a classic. I get that.
I will say, even though this film is filled with a ton of cliches, it also has a good way of subverting expectations, I think. Like, one character that comes to mind for me specifically for this is the character Pops. At the very beginning of the film, he's like, I'm getting a hardship discharge. And then they're like, haha, no, you're not. You're going to Bastogne. Um, and so the entire time he's just like, I'm a civilian, this, that. And like the entire film sets him up to be the guy that's like, Of course he's going to die. He's the one that's supposed to go home. But instead they make him the witness, if you will. He is the witness to pretty much every tragedy in this film. And he still gets to go home, but he has to go home with all of that weight now. So I thought that was a great way of subverting a very easy thing I think this film could have done, or most other 40s films would have.
Yeah, I think
I actually I saw the lack of music as a subversion. Like, I was expecting a big peppy soundtrack, the classic 1940s soundtrack. And not only do you not get the classic 1940s soundtrack, you get no soundtrack, you get no music at all. Instead, you get sound effects, which make, like, I told Tony this morning, like, the movie's very eerie at times because there's no music at all. It's just like the wind howling, this fog hanging over. You hear the clatter of like machine guns very softly in the background in the distance. It's very, very atmospheric. Which, again, not at all what I was expecting to find. Like, a very eerie kind of feel to the movie. I mean, Jack said the word he used was awkward. Yeah, I mean, it was awkward. That's at one point why I realized, wait a minute, there's no music. That's why it's weird. But it was weird in a good way to me. Like, Jack, when you said the word awkward, did you mean awkward like you didn't like the fact there was no music? Because once
Oh no,
I
I was
realized
fine
there
with
was
it.
no music, I did like it. I liked that.
Like, I didn't mean it in a negative sense. It just felt strange without any music. And the part that I liked was, yes, most of the good violence was off screen intentionally, probably. The censors probably didn't like that. But you could, like, see their feet, and one was clearly dying. And then he stands up and he spits out a bit of the dude's neck while blood is trailing down his neck, his face. No idea how they let that fly, as opposed to, stabbing a guy. But Jesus.
Yeah, that was another kind of interesting choice, because if you think about like other films of the time, like you get the kind of over the top, like loud ricochet, like "Pachoo!" And then like some guy clutches his chest and like "Ugh!" And we don't get that in this. It's like Jack said, you get these super like kind of like that scene in Saving Private Ryan where like when you see just the guy's boots like shaking and then the other guy stands up and he like spits out some blood, like even though we didn't see that, I immediately thought like the entire scene from Saving Private Ryan where that one-on-one fight happens, like that played in my head. I'm like, I'm genuinely curious like how much other people from that time period were able to like fill in that blank. So on that happy yeah, on that happy note, what are you gentlemen drinking this evening?
I have been drinking all day, actually. So I had multiple.
Oh,
I had multiple.
good for you.
I started early. I started around noon today. So I am having water to cool down from a day of drinking. I was out with some friends.
Oh.
A day of drinking.
Yeah. Well, when
shame, sir.
when you're 38 years old and you've reached middle age, a day of drinking means you've had like 3 drinks in the middle of the day, and you're like, oh man, this is a crazy day today.
Whoa, 38 is middle age. You take that back, young whippersnapper.
What are you imbibing in there, Tony? I see a brown liquid in that glass.
I am having a Knob Creek on the rocks. Most of the rocks have melted because I poured this prior to starting this. This is but my second for today because I had one of these with brunch about 11 o'clock this morning.
Nothing says brunch like a glass of whiskey. Jack?
What do you have in your glass there, John?
So one of the other things that really stuck out to me in this film that I figured I would pay homage to was that at the very end where the cloud cover lifts and the C-47s come in and are able to do their supply drops, and they open up one of the crates and they're like, yeah, rations, but they're all dinners. And the running joke throughout the film is nobody has coffee. Everybody, all they have are dinner K rations, and the dinner K rations come with lemonade. So what I'm having is lemonade, and it's mixed with Crown Royal. Just came out with a limited release thing. It's Crown Royal Blackberry. So I mixed some blackberry whiskey into my lemonade.
I see. And Jack?
I am drinking 2 drinks.
Double fisted.
But one's Budweiser.
Oh.
And the other's Mellow Yellow. And on that note, I gotta go pee, so I'll be back.
Winning combo, Jack.
I am an inveterate whiskey drinker. It's never the wrong time to have whiskey.
I still have a day job, so my drinking is limited to the weekends. And just the nature of my profession, they frown upon drinking during the regular weeks. So
Yes, I know the feeling. The other week I went out to GaryCon in Lake Geneva. I highly recommend GaryCon. If you like a good role-playing game convention, GaryCon is the place. But, of course, my plane leaves Baltimore at 8 a.m. About 8:30, the stewardess comes back and says, you're interested in a beverage? I'm like, yes, I'd like a glass of ice with bourbon. I'm like, pour away. And
well, I mean, as a flight stewardess, that can't have been new for her.
No, but I looked at my credit card receipts, my credit card statement when I got back from GaryCon.
I'm back. What I miss?
I may have consumed, but it's vacation. It's like you can't do that during the work week. During the work week, I'm, Monday evening, a couple with the guys at the club. And on the weekend, if my girlfriend and I go out to dinner or brunch or whatever, I'm 1 or 2. But then during the week, we're dry up in here.
Speaking of alcohol, I love the running joke that they had at the very beginning of the film about their gas masks.
Yes.
And I thought saying the joke once was fine, but then they kind of overplayed it a little bit where they're like, hey, did you hear this? Where it's like ditching their gas masks so that they can have an extra bag to carry around booze.
Well, and it's funny because infantry throughout history are quick to throw away anything that A, they think they can get away with throwing away, and B, they don't think they'll have a need for, because high command throughout history has always felt that the infantry can carry one more thing. So the infantry are constantly ditching, and not just the infantry. Gentleman I met through gaming explained that in the first Gulf War, his armored vehicle was equipped with some big, obnoxious secondary antenna that was part of their platoon communication rig, and it was forever fouling and required an inordinate amount of maintenance. So one day as they're rolling across the desert, it fell off. And that evening, as they're...
Can't control those things.
Right. That evening, as they're rounding up the vehicles for the night, an officer from higher up the unit came by and he's like, where is your PX123 antenna? And he looks, he's like, oh, it must have fallen off in our furious race across the desert. And the guy says, oh, you're in luck, because I found one laying in the sand some miles back this must be yours. And he hands him this thing, now crusted in sand on top of it all to reattach to his vehicle. He's like, son of a. But that
Isn't
throwing
that the
stuff,
way?
away is, the bag, evidently, from what I've read, the bag that was designed to hold the gas mask was like a next to perfect sling bag into which you could pack any sort of stuff.
Oh yeah, it was very popular because it was a rubberized bag, so you basically you had a waterproof satchel.
Yeah, you just had to get rid of that gas mask that your grandfather needed, but you don't.
Um, we just talking about kind of the getting rid of useless things. We just finished recording our review of the first episode of Band of Brothers. And that'll be out by the time this episode's out. But in that episode, we had a guest on. He was from the World War II Airborne Demonstration Team, which is a group of guys who, as their hobby, dress up as World War II paratroopers and go to air shows and fly in C-47s and then do parachute jumps from them.
Nice.
It's a very interesting group of guys.
Cool hobby.
So yeah, and we've had him on a couple of times, but we're like, who better to talk about like airborne training than the guy who literally reenacts every aspect of paratrooper training from World War II. But he was talking about how like paratrooper uniforms used to be like doused in this chemical that was supposed to be, not make their uniforms chemical proof, but like chemical resistant so that they wouldn't get burns and stuff if there was a gas attack. But it also made the uniforms essentially waterproof. So it was like you had these guys who were running around France in the middle of June in essentially like Gore-Tex jackets. And eventually at like the first opportunity they got, they would go to like restaurants or bars or whatever and find like the biggest pot and just like boil the crap out of it, and it like would bleach their uniforms in the process. But they're like, at least we're not sweating anymore.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. It was they impregnated the fabric with something or other, and of course, what it did was make it hot and itchy. Because that's definitely what you want in a combat environment, is for your uniform to be uncomfortable.
You mentioned training, and that reminded me of something else I had read about Battleground, about the film. That the director, the guy who was the World War I fighter pilot, he put all the actors through 3 weeks of boot camp, and he found a World War II drill instructor to be the drill instructor for this 3 week boot camp, which was apparently very rigorous. And within days of starting the boot camp, the super high paid famous actor that they had cast in the lead role went up to the director and was like, "Yeah, I'm not doing this," and he quit. So they lost. MGM had assigned them like one of their stars. His name was Robert Taylor. He was like a really famous actor in the 40s, and he was supposed to be the star of Battleground, and he wouldn't do the boot camp.
We just had a similar story for our recent review. We did Taps, but the opposite happened, where Taps is Tom Cruise's, I want to say it's his debut film and a primary role. And he originally wasn't supposed to be in a primary role, but apparently during the first couple of days of like their little in-house boot camp thing, they noticed him and they're like, you know what, we'll make you a main character. And within the same time period, he's like, this boot camp thing is stupid, and he like stayed at a hotel. He's like, call me when the shooting starts.
He's lucky
There
he still
must
had a
have
role.
been a dearth of actors during that time period, that somebody looked at Tom Cruise and said, let's cast him as the lead. To this day, I do not understand how Tom Cruise got a lead in anything.
I'm willing to give him this. I genuinely thought he did a good job in the movie Last Samurai. I thought that was an excellent film, and I thought his performance in that. But yes, in most ways, I would agree with you in the I don't know why anybody deals with you.
I mean, he didn't make Waterworld, but
Well, I think we're about at that time to rate this thing. Um, I don't know if you recall, but we don't do a standard 1 to 5 star rating around here because we think that's boring. Um, I have an idea for a rating, but I'm open to suggestions. I personally think that a 1 to 5 half loaf of bread should be our rating because that was such a coveted item. But I'm open to suggestions if we're not feeling that.
It was
I was
either going to
gonna
be
say
that or
eggs.
eggs. Yeah, eggs, eggs. Jack and I are on the same wavelength.
All right,
I'm
we can do 1 to 5 eggs.
I'm gonna have to throw my lot in with eggs.
All right,
Democracy is
eggs work.
beautiful.
Jack,
Uh,
since you came up with eggs, what score would you give it?
I gotta say, 4 eggs, and one of them is smashed in the helmet you have to hurriedly put on.
all right, Tony.
I'm gonna give it 4 eggs. It is not a perfect film. It's innovative. It's well made. For its day, I think it was quite special. I think that as over the years, as our views of war movies and movies in general have changed, it does show its age. So I'll give it 4 out of 5 eggs.
Greg.
I'm going to give 2 scores depending on who you are. If you flipped on Turner Classic Movies and you just happened upon Battleground and you didn't know anything about the context of this film, probably 3 eggs. If, however, you did know a little bit about the background of the film, I definitely would elevate that to 4. Uh, can't go 5. And I have heard it said and read multiple places people say that this is the greatest war film ever made. I mean, I don't know how you quantify the greatest war film ever made. That's obviously very subjective, but this would not have qualified for my Mount Rushmore of, personal great war films. It would be close though. I mean, this would be top 10 for sure. And I can understand why in 1949 this would have been considered groundbreaking. We are a long way removed from 1949, but in its context, in its time, I totally get what the fuss was about.
I I don't think it's fair to compare like film to film because obviously different films have different goals and different people involved, all that good stuff. But a long time ago, we reviewed the film Sands of Iwo Jima, and the thing that blew my mind about that film was, that film shares a lot of things with Battleground, but it also doesn't. They're very much their own films. But Rotten Tomatoes gave Sands of Iwo Jima a 100% rating, which I disagreed with. I think I gave Sands of Iwo Jima like 3 out of whatever cups of coffee that we did for that rating. But I'm going to do more than a 4 egg rating here because I think this film is better than Sands of Iwo Jima, and Sands of Iwo Jima is another critically acclaimed film, or like because it's held in such regard. I want to purposely give Battleground a higher rating than Sands of Iwo Jima. So for that reason, it's not getting a full 5. I'm giving it 4 eggs, and the 5th egg is just the shell that the guy tosses over his shoulder at his buddy. So it's like a 4.5. 4.5.
Very
Excellent.
nice.
Speaking of Rotten Tomatoes, Jack, how did we fare against them? Jack.
Uh-oh.
Jack. go to
Oh,
the
sorry,
bathroom again.
I clicked on the wrong mic. Anyway, so the tomometer for this says 78%. However, the audience score is 83%.
So I mean, if
I'm
you
gonna
split
go
the
with the
difference,
audience.
I mean, if you split the difference, that's generally what we came to about here. So that tracks. That is unfortunate that Rotten Tomatoes place it. Well, I mean, other than giving it a 100%, it wasn't going to match Sands of Iwo Jima. But I really, for as critically acclaimed as it is, I was expecting it to have a higher thermometer rating.
I'm surprised the critic score is lower than the audience score for this film. I would have thought that critics might appreciate this film a little more for its innovation versus just a straight audience score. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it's different. Well, that is our review of Battleground. Highly recommend that anybody listening to this who hasn't already watched it go out and check it out. At this time, Greg, Tony, if you would like to share the good word of Little Wars TV, have at it. Share Instagram, Facebook, YouTube's, what have you. Any big events you got coming up, let the people know, and floor is yours.
Well, you can find Little Wars TV anywhere the internet exists. We're primarily a YouTube channel, but we're on all the social media platforms, and with over 300 some videos on YouTube, you're bound to stumble across one of them if you type Little Wars TV into Google. We're a historical wargaming channel, so we cover all eras of military history with miniature toy soldiers playing strategy games. We've actually been on a break for a while. We haven't filmed any war games since the fall of last year, but we are hoping to do a couple this year, and we've been keeping the lid pretty tight on what the topics will be. But I know there's a couple of topics, one of which is a World War II topic. Where we're hoping to go down to Baltimore to do some filming on the last ship that is still afloat from Pearl Harbor. I actually, took a little bit of research, and I didn't know this. I know some other guys in the club did, that of all the ships present in December 1941, only one is still around, and it's in Inner Harbor in Baltimore, which is pretty cool. So I'm excited to go aboard, check it out. I'm sure we'll be getting some good footage of that.
Well, that's great, and I'm looking forward to it. I've been in a little bit of a withdrawal since you guys have been on your hiatus.
Hoping to be back soon.
I'm excited that you mentioned Pearl Harbor because I've always dug your different naval war games, especially your Battle of Hampton Roads game that you did.
Yeah, on the deck of the replica monitor, which is pretty fun.
Fun little fact: I have the monitor and Merrimack tattooed on my feet.
On your feet?
Yes.
Interesting.
So I have the monitor on one foot, I have the Merrimack on the other foot, and when I put my feet together, they look like they're shooting at each other.
So you are really into that battle.
Yeah. I'm a big history nerd. I in college, my capstone paper for my history degree was the innovations in naval warfare technology by the Confederate Navy. So
submarines, yeah,
all sorts of good stuff.
That's
so
cool.
I'm weird like that, but I'm at the point in my tattoo journey where I get a lot of dumb shit put on my body now. So because all the meaningful stuff is done, so
we're just filling in the blanks now.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, I like Civil War naval history. Why not? Let's get some ironclads.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for the opportunity to come on, and
Absolutely.
of course, I want to thank Tony for suggesting the film. I appreciate the fact that I got to check out something completely new and unexpected, and also read about the backstory of how it came about, and a really interesting and solid choice. So, good on you, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And
John, Jack, thank you. Thank you for having us.
I was just going to say, I also appreciate your movie choice. It's aside from enjoying the content that you guys produce on your channel, one of the big reasons we like having guests on, aside from changing up the flow of the conversation and getting different points of view, is it allows us to see movies that we otherwise probably wouldn't watch. You know, Battleground was on our list of films. We have like 150 some films on our list right now. And who knows when or if we would have gotten around to it. It definitely would not be like either mine or Jack's like top tier, like, oh, let's do this film next. So that's why I really appreciate having you guys on, because guests like you push us to watch films we otherwise probably wouldn't get around to.
Well, again,
But
I'm just glad we had the opportunity.
uh, it's been great having you guys on. Jack, do you have anything?
I got nothing other than it's been a
All,
pleasure.
all right. Well, if you enjoyed this show, go give the guys at Little Wars TV a follow. Uh, Also, leave a review. The stars do matter. If you want additional content from us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Discord, all those good places at Armchair Commanders. And until next week, I've been John,
And I've been Jack.
and we will catch you all later.
Bye.